Some days you just don't know what to draw. And whenever this happens, I like to take a look into the past. I like to look at old works and think, what drove me here? What inspired me? What about what I was feeling here at the time made me really jump up and say, you know what, I have to capture this in images, visual images that I draw with my own two hands. But when that inevitably doesn't work, I'll just take something that I drew in the past and go, you know what, I'm just gonna do this again, and hopefully it'll be at least a little better this time. Hopefully. And so that's exactly what I did. I dug up this old drawing, which was simply titled Gun Witch, which I drew about 6 months ago at time of recording, and I thought I'd give it another go. This character isn't particularly from anything, or it's not a fan art or anything like that, it's just something that I pulled out of my twisted inner psyche. Let's not psychoanalyze it too much. I also thought it would be a good idea to record my process and allow me to go back and really revisit what I was thinking about at the time while I was drawing in a kind of Speedpaint type scenario. Anyway, here's that. Whenever I start my drawing process, I don't really know what the final result is going to end up being. We can sort of see here that I'm toying around with some basic shapes and poses without really having a fair idea of where I want the drawing to go. To me, this is a very sort of integral part of my process. I like to throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks, but let's be real, most of the time I just end up going with a nice hand-on-hip kind of pose. I do the same thing with photographs though, so let's not look too deep into that. I started this drawing by giving myself a kind of vertical box shape to fit the character into. Something about starting with a box or a panel of some kind really lets me sort of knuckle down and, figure out the exact overall shape I want the character to be in. If I know the space that I'm going to be working with, sometimes it's a lot easier to visualize the drawing as I'm making it. Very quickly, I like to rough out the overall body shape with the blue lines, as we can see here. Eventually, I'll go over that with another color to sort of separate the two, but to me, it's really good to get a sort of thumbnail down of what I want the vague shape of the final character to look like. As I'm started drawing this character at the start, there's a couple of things going through my mind. One, I'm not too particularly happy with how her face is coming out. We can sort of see that as I'm going through the drawing, I'll erase it and redo the face a good couple of times. In the original drawing, she looked a little bit bored or blasé, and that's a kind of attitude that I wanted to continue with this redraw, but also make it a little bit more expressive in the long run. In terms of the outfit, I'm keeping things relatively similar as I start out. However, I'm making a few tweaks and changes as I go. For one, her shoulder pads in the original drawing were kind of flat. They looked to be almost like light leather armor, whereas in this redraw I thought I'd give them a bit more bulk, kind of like a more modern fantasy Cadian soldier rather than a light armored rogue or something like that. To me, a key part of the original character design that I made was this kind of wooden mage's staff that was also a gun, so I really wanted to keep its original shape and design. I'm adding the handle, I'm adding the stock. I think it's kind of funny that I don't give the staff any sort of trigger mechanism, like it's magic. You don't need to pull a trigger to fire it. You can also see from time to time I like to mirror the canvas. This really helps me sort of identify flaws in the drawing. Like when you look at a drawing for a while, it sort of starts to all blend together, but as soon as you flip it back to front, that's when everything really jumps out at you. Now, drawing each individual bullet across a belt sash thing can be a little bit of a tedious task, so to start off with, I use a simple dot brush that I run across her body, just to get a vague idea of where all the bullets are going to end up being. I draw circles around these dots to act as the base of the bullets, and then I sort of push them upwards to solidify their shape. I don't try to get too technical here because I know full well that I'm the kind of person who would stress over every minute detail of this belt sash for hours on end, and you know what, at the end of the day, nobody's really going to be looking at the drawing in that tight a detail. So I just try to make them all vaguely bullet-shaped. I also know I'll paint them gold just so it'll, heighten the bulletness of it all. After the rough sketch is down, I start going over the sketch with the vector lines to add some inking to the drawing. I know full well that I'm also going to pull and twist some of these lines later. It's not going to look exactly 100% like the sketch that I've done, but drawing with vector lines in Clip Studio Paint gives me a little bit of flexibility, so I can easily edit these lines after I've drawn them. Now, from a lot of these flashing lights that we can see appearing in front of us in the Speedpaint, we can really see that my inking process is really just a matter of drawing a whole bunch of lines until I vaguely feel like I've gotten one of them right, which I think is a key part of the process. You know, it's a lot of trial and error, it's throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks, and that's what really works for me. Although I do know that because I'm using vector lines, I have the freedom to pull and twist and edit them later, which does free up my mind palace a little bit and keeps the drawing process from being too stressful. We can also see here I took a little bit of a drink break. That's always important to do to break up your workflow. Now, as I begin the coloring process, I'm really just slapping things down with the fill bucket tool and just seeing what sticks. I'm using the original image as a very heavy reference when I'm sorting out the colors. However, I felt like in the original image, a lot of the colors that I used did end up being a little bit greenish, or they all had a bit of a green tint to them, for lack of a better term. To be honest, this sort of came down to me using a very quick sort of lighting and shadow structure across the drawing, and I ended up using a bit of a green light that made her look a little bit sickly, for lack of a better term. So while I'm using the original drawing and basically color picking the colors straight from there, I'm making an active effort to keep them a little bit more vibrant in this second part of the drawing. It's very subtle, but what you can sort of see I'm doing here is I'm making some of these lines colored lines instead. So I'm going over the top of the inking layer with a masking layer and essentially just painting over the top of those lines to give them a sense of color. To me, using masking layers really help with the coloring process because it allows me to essentially paint over the lines that I'm drawing without changing the color of the lines themselves. Because I'm using vector lines, this is pretty difficult to do. And for a bit of an example of what I'm talking about, here's what the drawing looks like with the masking layers deactivated, so you can really see how I'm just putting splotches of color over the lines, and the use of the masking layer essentially tells Clip to only render those colors directly over the lines that I'm using. Now it's very subtle, you can't really see a lot of what I'm doing here, but what I'm doing is going through and editing some of the width of some of these vector lines. Using Clip Studio's vector tools, you can actually change the width of the lines after you've drawn them, which I think is good for making real subtle tweaks to your inking. Now I have a very simple sort of shading style that I use when I go to shade drawings. I essentially color pick an entire section of the drawing, for example her skin or her clothes or her armor, and then on a layer on top of that, I fill the entire block of color with a darker shade. Then, using a textured eraser tool, I'll start incrementally erasing some of that shade to make sure that the shade only exists around the periphery of her skin, where the shadows would sit, things like that. Now, this method is simple, it doesn't give you a lot of control over where those shadows go, but if you just want to slap some basic color down on a drawing, I feel like it's a really quick and efficient way of doing that. Now, one thing that's very subtle is the way that I've colored these sort of potions that are sitting on her belt. These probably had the most layers out of any part of the drawing, which is ironic because they're such small details. Essentially, I used a couple of masking layers, a couple of blending layers to give the liquid inside those potions a little bit more three-dimensionality and a couple of sparkles there for flair. Now, in the original version of this drawing, I was kinda lazy with the wood texture on her staff, so in this time I added a bit of texture to the staff more manually. I went through using a darker pencil tool and really added some of that grain myself. You can see in the original drawing, I basically just slapped a wood texture on there and made it run up the length of the staff, which, you know what, is kind of a lazy move, but I'm kind of a lazy guy, and it got the job done at the end of the day. Towards the end here, I'm adding some metallic glow to certain parts of her outfit, and also just washing her body in an overall glow to add some highlight towards those central areas to differentiate them from shadow. Now, in some very specific areas, like under her chin or under her bandana, I have added some harder shading manually, just to get some more form and three-dimensionality, and essentially to separate them from each other. Finally, I turn the background square back on, fill it with a bit of a flat color, and give her a drop shadow, and I'm more or less ready to call this drawing done. I definitely think she looks a little bit nicer and a little bit more polished than the original drawing I made 6 months ago, and at the end of the day, I'm very happy with how she turned out. To me, redrawing an old drawing is a fun little exercise to get your brain working and get you thinking about things that you maybe didn't think about the first time around. Improving in art and drawing is all about practice, so to me, anything that gets your bones moving and gets you putting pen to canvas is always a good exercise in my book. And hopefully my thought process was at least mildly interesting to listen to. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and have a wonderful week, I guess. I gotta figure out a better way to end these things.